This is the Read to Lead podcast, episode 562, February 2025.
It gives us a more holistic understanding of individuals, and it also allows us to break out of this notion that we're just being put in a box. Right? I think that's always what people didn't like when it comes to personality psychology is like, yeah, you're just really putting me in this box here, and that's where I have to stay. That's no longer true.
As algorithms become increasingly adept at assessing the human mind, they also become more and more powerful at controlling it, enticing us to buy a certain product or vote for a certain political candidate. Some of us say this technological trend is no big deal. Others consider it one of the greatest threats to humanity. But what if the truth is more nuanced and mind-bending than that? Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is the Read to Lead podcast with our second installment of 2025. Our February book is Mindmasters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior by Sandra Matz. There are more pieces of digital data than there are stars in the universe. This data helps us monitor our planet, decipher our genetic code, and take a deep dive into our psychology. And in Mindmasters, Columbia Business School professor Sandra Matz reveals in fascinating detail how big data offers insights into the most intimate aspects of our psyches and how these insights empower an external influence over the choices we make. This can be creepy, manipulative, and downright harmful. Yet big data also holds enormous potential to help us live healthier, happier lives. Mindmasters is a riveting look at what our digital footprints reveal about us, how they're being used for good and for ill, and how we can gain power over the data that defines us. If you like what you hear today and want to join a community of like-minded people where we dig deeper into these topics face-to-face in our live monthly trainings and in numerous other ways, then you want to be a member of the Read to Lead community. To find out more about that, simply go to jeffbrown.me, where you can start a free 2-week trial. If it's not everything you hoped it would be, there's no obligation. But if you enjoy being a part of the community, and I think you will, it's just $9 a month after your 2-week trial. Again, just go to jeffbrown.me. Well, Sandra, I'm very excited to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for being here, first of all.
Well, thanks for having me.
I am also excited to share with you that I received a list of books I might feature from Nina, who I know works with you. And I took that list and I shared it with my online community, the Read to Lead community. And I said to that community, tell me who we should feature from this list. Some people answered with one book. Most people answered with multiple books. Every single person who responded to that question listed your book. In fact, your book was the only book that got mentioned by every single person.
That's makes me very happy because it's why I wrote the book in the first place, right? I think it's a topic that I realized more people care about these days. So I wanted to have something out there that people can make sense of.
Yeah. And in the introduction, you open with focusing on the tension between privacy and community. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to elaborate on your vision for a redesigned data ecosystem.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I've been thinking for a long time of how do you make this topic of data and machine learning, AI, somewhat relatable for people in a way that highlights both obviously the risks that we see constantly play out in the media, but then also all of these opportunities that come within. And the analogy that I've been using for a while now is this kind of equivalence to my experience of growing up in a village. So growing up in this really tiny community of 500 people somewhere in the southwest corner of Germany, for me meant that I had people in my life all the time, right? So my neighbors knew exactly what I was doing. They knew who I was dating, what I was doing on the weekends. And you can imagine that they're not just in my life, they're actually trying to influence the choices that I made, what I was doing and so on. And on the one hand, that was amazing. It was amazing because there was someone who truly understood me and tried to help me in situations where maybe I wasn't sure what I wanted to do after high school. Maybe I wasn't really sure if I should take a gap year, if I should study psychology, but they could offer this really personalized advice. But then also, obviously, there was this flip side of them poking around in my life and trying to pull the strings behind my back in a way that I didn't fully appreciate. And for me, in a way, what we experience today with technology, data, algorithms is very similar, right? So algorithms taking our behavior, trying to understand who we are, what we want, can be, on the one hand, really intrusive. And oftentimes we know that this happens without us ever understanding that this is the case or having any control over how they're being used. But there's also something potentially beautiful about the possibility of algorithms in kind of helping us accomplish some of the goals that we have and that we otherwise have a hard time seeing through. So that's a little bit how I kind of think of this community aspect, but then also potentially manipulation and intrusion.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of that here as our discussion moves along. The first chapter unpacks how algorithms decode our psychology from our digital footprints, and you even use your morning routine as an example of the vast amount of data that we generate. Talk about or maybe reflect on the human impact of this technological leap on our sense of self and our relationships, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's for me, the interesting part is actually, right, when we talk about big data, oftentimes people just assume that it's the sheer volume of data that we generate. And that's true. So every hour, average person generates about 6 gigabytes of data, and that's obviously massive. But for me, the more interesting part is really the breadth of insights that we can get from this data, right? Anything from what you do, where you go, who you meet, and then deeper into, okay, here's the person behind the data. We can learn something about your preferences, your routines, your habits that really give us an insight into your psychology and not just the behaviors that we see borne out in the data. And you can imagine, like, coming back to this analogy of the village, it means that algorithms can now understand who we are just by looking at the data, right? If they see that you spend a lot of money on going to the pubs, yeah, maybe you're kind of a more extroverted person. If your phone constantly runs out of battery, which for me isn't just a hypothetical, that probably means, sadly, that you might not be the most organized person, right? There's all of these different breadcrumbs of your existence that we can see and pick up on the data. But then the more, for me at least, the somewhat more critical part is not just that it offers this window into your psychology, but also that it gives others power over your behavior. And if I think about the human impact, for me, that's the piece that I want people to be aware of a lot more, right? So it's this algorithmic influence that once I understand who you are, I can probably use it to push you in a certain direction. And sometimes that's amazing because that's a direction that you want to go in and you're just having a hard time making it happen. And sometimes that might be a direction that you didn't really want to go in and it just someone else benefits from you going in.
I've always taken exception with those who say that, well, online, nobody ever posts anything but their highlights. You know, it's the good stuff. It's a highlight reel. It's all it is. I think it is curated to a large extent. That's the word I would use. But in many aspects, it's also authentic. How do you reconcile the authenticity of our online identities with the pressure to perform for an audience? And what does that mean for the accuracy of psychological predictions?
Yeah, it's such a great question because I think we all have this impression of, right, if you look at the stuff that people post on social media, you're constantly on vacation, you're doing great, you're having avocado, it's just like eating super healthily, and there's never any kind of really more depressing side to it. Now, what I think is interesting is that even this part of your identity that's somewhat more idealized, right, is like, here's the life that I would like to live, is still part of you, right? It might not be who you currently are, but even the fact that this what you're aspiring to become is in a way part of your identity. And the other thing is that it's called social media, right? And it's social. So the moment that you go overboard entirely and you suddenly become this completely different person that you're really not, people are going to pick up on it. So oftentimes what happens is that everybody self-idealizes a little bit, but it's quite unlikely that, say, the most introverted person in like the offline world suddenly becomes the most extroverted person online just because your friends are still there, right? And your friends are somewhat of a checks and balance in terms of you going overboard entirely. And it's just such a small piece of the puzzle. So I think one of the one of the questions or statements that I oftentimes get when I give talks is like, well, I'm not using social media, so I'm kind of protected. And obviously it's like all of the self-idealized kind of signaling that people do there. But it's such a small piece of the puzzle, right? There's so much data that we generate that we don't intentionally curate. It's what we call a behavioral residue. So everything that happens on social media, psychologists would refer to as identity claims. So these very explicit signals. But there's all of these behavioral residue that you create without really thinking. That's anywhere from your smartphone capturing your location 24/7, right? Those are not signals that you put out there intentionally for someone to pick up on. Again, maybe your phone is running out of battery. Maybe I can pick up from your GPS signal that you're going to the grocery store 3 times a day. So that gives me some insight that you might not be, again, as good as planning ahead as some other people. And that's just as much of a piece of your identity puzzle as some of the more explicit, maybe slightly curated identity claims that you see on social media.
With regard to some of those, I think you used the term digital breadcrumbs earlier, the vulnerability created by this unintentional data trail that would create. What safeguards do you propose to protect us from the unintended exposure of our private lives through all this, especially when we're, as you say, often unaware of the volume of data being collected in the first place?
It's a super tricky question, right? So, and it's not that the problem is that it's not even just the technologies that we interact with. It used to be the case that people were worried about their browsing histories, their searches, the data gets captured by their smartphone. Now, just take the cameras that are scattered across the city, combine it with facial recognition, and even if you decided to leave all kind of technology at home, there's still someone who can pick up on your whereabouts, who you meet, and so on. And there is a way in which you can actually, because the argument typically is, well, we need this data to make sure that we offer like service, convenience, personalization, right? So the argument is always, well, if you want to use Google Maps and you need to get from A to B, we need to capture your location data. Or if you want to use Siri on your phone, we kind of need to capture your speech data because that's the only way that we can offer you this convenience and the service. Now, what we know is that in a way that's no longer true because we today have technology that allows you to give the same insights to people. So get you from A to B using Google Maps, or kind of make sure that your phone understands what you're saying and can respond appropriately without collecting the data in a central space. It's something that's called federated learning, and it just essentially makes use of the fact that your smartphone is a supercomputer, right? Your smartphone is so much more powerful than the computers that we used to launch rockets to space with a few decades ago. So what these companies that promise all of the service and convenience can do is they can just send the intelligence to your phone. That's how Apple actually trains Siri. So Apple doesn't grab all of your speech data and voice data in a central server. What they do is they send their model to your phone. So they know how to understand human language. They send it to your phone. It locally updates. It learns how to respond specifically to you. And then it shares back the intelligence, but not the data. So for all of the products that you actually have a say over, which is your phone, the products that you're using, and so on, there are ways in which you can get the same benefits without necessarily having to collect your data. The question that you kind of is still on the table, which is much harder to solve, is what do we do with all of the traces that are collected by governments that you don't even have any control over?
Yeah. Let's talk about personality a little bit. You argue our personalities are not fixed, but they fluctuate with situations. Context shapes our personality. I once had a conversation with an author named Michael Port, who wrote a book called Steal the Show on public speaking. And he talked about our use of the term chameleon to describe someone. When we use that term to describe someone, we usually use it in a derogatory sense, right? Yeah. They're a shapeshifter. But he argued that that's really a flawed analogy because all a chameleon is guilty of is adapting to its environment. It never stops being a chameleon, right? Yeah. And we're very much the same way. Unpack a little bit of the research you've done around context and connect it, if you would, to maybe actionable applications.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually one of these contexts that I think is fascinating. Because as you said, oftentimes when we talk about people who maybe act differently across different situations, we sometimes even think of it as like somewhat hypocritical, right?
Hmm.
Well, this is what you did, and this you were kind of very extroverted in this situation, but then I saw you and you were a lot more introverted. What is like it's not authentic the way that you show up. And I think you're absolutely right in that we also have this intuition about ourselves that we're not always the same, right? And we're a lot more dynamic in terms of identity than I think the typical traditional notions of personality made it out to be. So the way that personality psychologists traditionally thought about personality was this relatively static and pretty stable profile that people have. So most of the time you're very extroverted, most of the time you're open-minded. And once I understand this tendency, I can predict behavior across different situations. Now, this is to some extent still true, but we don't completely flip-flop. You very rarely have this person who can be extremely, extremely extroverted sometimes and extremely, extremely introverted. And that's still somewhat of it's not the norm. But what we know, and this is also how the thinking around personality has shifted, is that we now acknowledge that depending on the situation, depending on the context you're in, even if you're most of the time, say, more extroverted than 80% of the population, that's typically how we define it, is there's situations, if you're out with friends in a bar and it's social environment and you're having a lot of fun, there's conversations, there's stimulation, you'll probably shift a little bit upward from your 80% average, right? And if you're staying at home, you're reading a book, you're out doing gardening, that's probably a context where there's just not as much going on socially and there's not as much stimulation. So you probably think of yourself as somewhat more quiet and reserved in that context. So instead of saying you have this fixed profile, we now think of it as a distribution of states. So you have an average, and that kind of describes your personality trait. So that's your general tendency. Your average, if you're extroverted, might be a lot higher than my average, who's of someone who's like slightly more introverted. But still, there might be situations where you're, depending on, again, you're home reading a book and I'm out in a bar. So even though my average is typically lower than yours, maybe in this context, I'm slightly more extroverted than you because our distributions overlap. And that, for me, is, first of all, we understand behavior a lot better, right? So once we understand someone's individual tendency, but also understand the context, and that could range anywhere from what are the places that you visit. This is some of my own research. What are the activities that you engage in? And they all, in a slightly predictable way, shift your average up and down. And it's something that we now can capture with data, right? So a lot of the data traces that we get are somewhat dynamic. If I tap into your phone and I know your location, your GPS location, I can map it against Google. I can see, okay, you're currently in a coffee shop. I also see, based on the descriptions, it's like it's 4 p.m. It's probably somewhat packed. I can even see this from like how many people are showing up at the same time based on, again, their GPS locations.
Right.
And then make inferences like, yeah, based on your ambient sound from your phone, there seems to be a lot of chatter going on. Maybe I can hear some live music. So maybe you're in a more extroverted situation currently. So I think it gives us a more holistic understanding of individuals. And it also allows us to kind of break out of this notion that we're just being put in a box. Right? I think that's always what people didn't like when it comes to personality psychology, is like, yeah, you're just really putting me in this box here, and that's why I have to stay. That's no longer true.
You mentioned persuasion versus manipulation a moment ago. How do you distinguish, Sandra, between ethical persuasion and manipulation in psychological targeting, and where do you draw the line in practice?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's not trivial to solve, in the sense that even if you ask people, like let's say I ask 100 people what they think is manipulation and what they think is persuasion, you will get vastly different answers, right? So I can give you my personal take, but then if you sampled 100 opinions, I can guarantee you would get slightly different answers, depending on how they think about it. For me, the distinction in a way is, first of all, do people understand what's happening, and is what you're trying to accomplish in their best interest? I think it's a very simple kind of equation, or at least doesn't hurt them, right? So sometimes you might not be actually helping someone become a better person by selling them the toothpaste that you want to sell them, but you're probably not hurting them in the sense that you're now moving them further away from the goal that they actually have for themselves. And for me, that's a very critical distinction, and it's a very easy one to make, right? I think most people working on products, working on like a way of targeting people, a way of making recommendations, if they kind of really take a step back and reflect on it for a second, they probably know if the people on the other side appreciate what they're doing or they don't. So for me, that's in a way the distinction or the thought experiment that I would want people to go through as they think about, is it manipulation or is it mere persuasion, which could be neutral, or is it actually something that helps people?
Let's talk a bit about the good. You spend a chapter on this. I think it's chapter 6. What's the most promising application of psychological targeting for societal benefit that you've seen? And what would you say are some barriers that we have to overcome in order to scale that effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really kind of, if you think about this idea that psychological targeting means trying to understand where someone is coming from and then potentially being able to nudge their behavior, it can be applied to so many different things, right? Kind of make education more personal and effective, and try to help people with some of the goals that they struggle with. Instead of selling them products, maybe help them save some money for a rainy day. The application that I am personally the most excited about is probably mental health. And that's just because the baseline is so terrible, right? If you think about the way that we currently track and treat mental health is just, it's so rudimentary. Like even if you start with the tracking, like the diagnostic part, typically what happens is that you have to be pretty far down the road for you to be diagnosed, and you have to actively reach out to someone, right? If you take depression, for example, it's one of these things that we know there's a treatment for, and we know that there's still an insane number of suicides around the world just because people don't get diagnosed and they don't get the treatment. And it's really hard because once you're in this valley of depression, first of all, you're so inward focused that it's very hard for you to say, hey, I should be reaching out to get some support. And then in many parts of the world, even if you did, there's just no one there to help and support you. So what we know technology can do is essentially try to catch you really early on, and not really in the sense that we offer a perfect diagnosis. It's more like an early warning system. So the example of some of the research that I've done in that space is actually looking at using your smartphone to detect early signs of depression. So instead of you having to reach out to a clinician and say, walk me through this questionnaire and this diagnostic tool, I can passively tap into your smartphone and say, well, maybe there's deviations from your regular typical behavior, right? That could be you're not leaving the house as much anymore. There's much less physical activity. You're not taking as many calls as you typically do. So that's like a drop in social interaction. We know that the language that you use, for example, can be indicative of whether you might be emotionally distressed. So one of the interesting findings there is that the more you talk about yourself, the more likely it is that you actually suffer from something like anxiety and depression. So if you use more first-person pronouns like I, me, myself, that's not a sign of narcissism, which was my first guess when I heard about the findings. But it's just a signal that you kind of, what you worry about is like, why am I feeling so bad? Am I going to get better? How do I get better, right? In those moments, you don't think about solving the world's biggest problems. What you think about is yourself, and that creeps into the language that you use. And we can, in a way, use all of these signals combined and say, hey, again, it might be nothing. Maybe you're just on vacation, sitting at home, enjoying your life and reflecting on what's going on in your day-to-day. So don't take it as a diagnosis, but if you think there might be something to it, why don't you try and get some help? And then this is the second part where if you look at the way that we currently treat, right? So the way that we offer support to people who might be suffering from something like depression, there's this huge gap in supply and demand. So for every 100,000 people worldwide looking for a therapist, there's essentially 13 mental health professionals, right? And you can imagine they're not equally distributed. If you're trying to find a therapist on the Upper East Side, or in Manhattan, you're probably going to get one. But if you try and find someone in other parts of the world that's affordable, the picture looks very different. So what AI can offer these days, they're probably not going to replace therapists, right? Because there's still something that kind of helps you having this interaction with another human being. Right. But there's certainly a way that they can offer something that's better than nothing to people who might want to have that support and want to have it in a personalized way that really speaks to them and how they might most benefit from mental health support. So this is just one context where I think this idea that we understand someone's psychology from their behavior and we can use it to help and interact is just extremely promising. Obviously, it also comes with risk. So I don't pretend that this is something that we should just kind of implement at scale without further thinking, but certainly a big opportunity.
With regard to privacy loss, you critique a couple of fallacies, at least one of which I've been guilty of uttering in the past. One is I have nothing to hide. And the other is, in light of what I get in return, it's worth it to give this or that up. But there's a lack of reciprocity in data relationships, you argue. How do you propose that we rebuild trust in a data ecosystem where the power imbalance feels so entrenched? And what role can we possibly play in that process as individuals?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm guilty of these fallacies, right? I remember kind of getting into this space, and there's many moments where I feel like, well, yeah, it's worth it. But there's also many moments where I feel like that's actually not true, right? So what I want people to think is like, in an ideal world, you would probably prefer to have both. Right? If you could live in a world where you get both privacy and agency and self-determination, the ability to make your own choices, and you get the service and the convenience that comes with others using your data, you would probably prefer to have both. So I just hope that people ask for more than just kind of go with this, okay, I'm just going to accept all of the downsides because I want the upsides. And the same is true for the I have nothing to hide. That's a very, first of all, privileged position to be in, because it's not true for everybody. And it's also somewhat short-sighted, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So even if you feel perfectly safe and protected today, the data that you generate is permanent and it's going to be there the moment it gets created. That's not true for leadership, right? So that could be the CEOs of companies who might have very different plans tomorrow than they have today. That's true for governments, which I think is something that we've seen kind of playing out in the US in recent weeks, where kind of suddenly the data that is out there kind of has people worried about how it's being used. So for me, the question of how do we actually protect ourselves becomes like top of mind, right? And I think that's the same is true for people. Now, you spoke about regulation. I think I've just become a lot more pessimistic over the last couple of years with the idea of like all we need to do is give people kind of tell people what's happening with their data and give them control over managing it, right? I think this is the foundation of a lot of the more progressive data protection regulations that you see in Europe, that you see in California. And the idea is a great one, right? I think the idea that people need to know what's happening and they need to have control, absolutely necessary. I just don't think it's sufficient because it's such a full-time job. If you think about like how quickly technology moves, I think about this stuff 24/7 and I have a hard time keeping up. So expecting a person who's not as involved to constantly anticipate, okay, here's the potential benefits of using my data, the potential downsides now and in the future, is like, it's almost impossible. And then we all have only 24/7 in a week, right? So if you really wanted to responsibly manage your data by reading through all of the terms and conditions, going through all of the permissions that your phone asks when you download an app, that would be a full-time job. That's the only thing that we would be doing day to day. So I just don't think that we can put this burden on users and consumers to say, yeah, I now have to step up and I have the responsibility to manage my data. I'd much rather see these more systemic changes where we say, how do we make it easy for people to do the right thing, right? We talked about federated learning before. If I can eliminate this trade-off between you having to give your data for you to benefit, if I can just keep the data on my phone and still get the same service and convenience, well, you can kind of eliminate trust with a trustworthy system. So that's how I've been thinking about it a lot more recently, is like, how do we change the system so that all of the choices that people can make most of the time are rather good ones?
I would imagine it's difficult to, and maybe the question is, how do we convince companies and policymakers to adopt your proposed ecosystem changes when their incentives often favor data exploitation over protection? I mean, how do you make that shift?
I think it's such a great question, and I've been thinking about this a lot because you're absolutely right. And if there's no incentives for companies to do that, I don't think we're going to see anything change. This is particularly true in the US, where also industry has like such a stronghold on government, right? It's like a little bit different in like, let's say Europe, where I think regulation is a little bit easier to pull off. So the argument that I've been making is essentially, unless you're in the business of selling personal data, right? If you're Facebook, it's really hard for you to change anything, because really what you're selling, the product is the user. You're selling kind of personal information to third parties through advertising and so on. But for all of the companies for whom that's not true, you're actually much better off implementing something like federated learning and not collecting all of this personal data. Like the moment that you collect personal data, you're essentially accumulating this pile of gold that you're now sitting on and that other people are probably trying to steal, right? If you look at the incidence of data breaches over the last couple of years, has gone up dramatically. If you look at the cost of these data breaches, has also gone up dramatically. So there's this pretty substantial financial risk and reputational risk of companies who collect all of this data. Now, the argument for the longest time, which was an accurate argument, was, well, but we need this data if we want to actually compete in the market and offer the same service and for the products that we're creating. But that's no longer true. But if I can offer through federated learning, I can offer the same service and convenience, you're much better off saying, like, I'm the company who offers you exactly the same thing. I'm not sitting on this pile of gold, and I can actually make it part of the value proposition to consumers, saying that I'm the company who actually takes privacy seriously. If you look at Apple, that's exactly what they're doing, right? Apple is not in the position of Facebook because they're a B2C. They're selling directly to customers. If you walk through New York and you see all of the ads that Apple puts out there, it's all about privacy. It's all about we're the ones protecting your data better than some of the other devices like Android, and which is actually true, by the way. So if you look at Android devices, the moment that you download an app, even if you haven't used the app for the last 3 months, it happily collects data on you 24/7, whereas Apple actually shuts down some of the data collection or uses federated learning in the first place. So they're using this kind of ability to offer the same service without needing to collect the data in a way that actually kind of reduces the security risk and also allows them to make a selling point to customers. So I think there's probably going to be a shift, especially with the big players moving first, and that we see over the next couple of years.
Your last chapter advocates for data co-ops, something inspired by the village reciprocity you saw growing up. What lessons from that upbringing would you say most inform your vision for data co-ops, and how do you see them evolving to meet what are obviously diverse global needs?
Yeah. So the idea of data co-ops, or like the way that I think about how do we solve this problem, right? If we really believe that there's opportunities that are created by using data, but there's also these challenges and risks. Regulation typically tries to mitigate the risks, right? Regulation is kind of focused on how do we protect the average person from the most egregious abuses, but it doesn't really do anything to help every individual maximize the value or maximize the utility they can get from the data. That's not typically what regulation is focused on. For that, we need a somewhat more flexible model that says, okay, here's what you're trying to accomplish, and now I'm going to help you get to this goal. And data co-ops, they're essentially communities of like-minded people. So you can imagine, well, back in the village, that was like my family had vineyards, and we kind of harvested grapes every fall, but we definitely didn't have enough grapes or the expertise to turn it into wine. And so what happens in this region is that a lot of families who have these little parcels of land and harvest grapes, they come together and they either sell the grapes to like the bigger wineries, and they can do so at a premium, right? Because you now have a lot more bargaining power because you have a lot more grapes, or you hire experts that help you make the wine. You can translate the concept to data co-ops, which essentially says, do we have communities, and they don't have to be physically co-located. It could be communities around the world that have a shared interest in using data. My favorite example these days is expecting moms, right? As someone who's expecting a baby, you want to have a very good reading of here's what I should be doing every step along the way to make sure that I'm healthy and the baby is healthy. That's not how the system currently works. You go to your doctor every 4 weeks and you maybe get like an ultrasound and a heartbeat. It's like, yeah, baby's still alive. That's pretty much the extent to which you get advice. But there's an enormous potential of, say, kind of expecting moms coming together, pulling their genetic data, pulling their medical histories, their lifestyle data, and so on, to get a read of, okay, given who you are and the current situation that you're in, here's some advice of what you could do to make sure that you're okay and the baby is okay. Now, I don't want this data to go to pharma companies, right? They could probably process it and maybe make some recommendations, but I don't trust them.
Right.
What I want is the moms coming together. And now the same way that the wine co-op created value for all of the members, like data co-ops are actually owned by the members. So the members have a say in how it's governed, what happens with the data. And because there's many people, first of all, the data becomes more valuable, right? If I just only have my own genetic data, my own medical history, there's almost no insights that I can draw from that. The moment that I have many people, there's a lot better insights that I can generate. And the data co-op has fiduciary responsibility. So it's legally obligated to act the same way that we do this in the financial services industry, right? It's obligated to act in the best interest of their members. So it's a totally different system, right? So suddenly you don't have Apple, pharma companies, Facebook grabbing your data for their own benefit and profit, but you have these member-owned communities that can both manage it, because now they can hire experts, right? If I said transparency and control is more of a responsibility than a right, if you have experts supporting you, it's fantastic, right? Because now suddenly you can actually exercise this control and turn it into what I think of as mastery. So that's the idea behind data co-ops. And we've seen a couple of them actually already exist. So the US has one for Uber drivers where they pool data to see how they can optimize their routes and make more money without necessarily being exploited. There's some in Switzerland that look at rare disease that are difficult to understand and to treat, like MS is one of the examples. So I think there's like it's still slowly, right? Because it's a very different way of thinking about data. But I do think that's another one of these developments that we're going to see grow over the next couple of years.
Got a tough question to end on here, asking you to pick one thing, the single most urgent step in your view that we have to take today to shape a data-driven future that prioritizes our well-being over exploitation, and why that step above all others, would you say?
Yeah, I think for me, that's the federated learning part. So I think if we can eliminate trade-offs for people where they have to either choose privacy, self-determination, or they choose service and convenience, we know that the brain is always going to pick service and convenience, right? There's almost no world that you can live in where someone prioritizes the other one, which means the only way to get around this is essentially eliminate the trade-off. So if that was implemented from today to tomorrow across all of the products, would be a complete game changer. And regulation could technically drive that change.
Awesome. Well, the book again is called Mindmasters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior. Her name is Sandra Matz, and her book was the one book that everyone in the community who responded said, interview this author. And now we can say that we have. Thank you so much for being here, Sandra. I really, really enjoyed your book, and a book that everybody needs to read, especially now.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And thanks to the community for picking the book. That absolutely made my day.
I would say members of the Read to Lead community know a good book and author when they see one. Choosing who we interview, asking questions on occasion of those we interview, and other benefits are just a part of what come along with being a member of the Read to Lead community. Again, I encourage you to sign up for a free 2-week trial at jeffbrown.me. For more on this episode, to connect with Sandra, and to learn more about her book, you can go to readtoleadpodcast.com/562 for episode 562. Again, that's readtoleadpodcast.com/562. If you missed our conversation last month with Margie Worrell about her book, The Courage Gap, be sure and check out that episode, either in your favorite podcast app or by going to readtoleadpodcast.com/561. That does it for this month. Hope to see you next month. Until then, as always, remember, leaders read and readers lead.